degree in international peace and conflict resolution. And I'm a consultant now, and my work focuses on intergroup dialogue, particularly around issues related to race and power. I do restorative justice work and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I apply an equity lens to my conflict transformation work. So I really bridge kind of the intersection of some of those disciplines. I was trained in social justice mediation, which is a form of mediation that addresses power dynamics within conflicts. And I actually used to work at SEEDS back in, when was that, 2015. I was a manager of the restorative justice programs and was working with schools and districts across the Bay Area. So I'm glad to be still connected to the SEEDS community. And like I said, glad to see some familiar faces. I've worked in nonprofits all my professional life, and I'm now working as a consultant. I said I'm in the early stages of founding a consulting collective called the Ripple Collective, and we're supporting groups and organizations to create authentic spaces for conversations and to navigate conflict in healthy and generative ways. I live in El Cerrito in the East Bay. Looks like a lot of folks are logging in from the East Bay. I have a 4.5-year-old who you may hear in the background. Just heads up about that, and much respect to all the parents and the caregivers of little ones who are navigating work and kiddo care in these pandemic times. That is real, so much respect. Okay, that's me. I want to acknowledge Selena, who I'm sure many of you know. Hi, Selena. Selena is the program coordinator at SEEDS, and she's going to be helping with Zoom tech support today and breakout groups. So grateful for your help, Selena. Do you want to say anything or introduce yourself anyway to the group?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ellie. That pretty much sums it up. I'm available for your tech questions, and then also just another note about the recording. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, so those spaces, please feel open to share. And looking forward to getting into this with you all today.
Thanks, Selena. Again, thank you so much for your support today. Appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I want to talk about some of the goals for our time together today. We're going to be reviewing some key concepts on power and privilege and neutrality, and exploring how these concepts are present in the mediation process. We're also going to be having opportunity to do we're engaging in some self-reflection and pair sharing, some small group conversation to deepen your thinking about some of these topics. And also we'll spend the last kind of half of the workshop identifying strategies to interrupt inequitable power dynamics. But that's a bit of what we're going to be focusing on for this afternoon. I want to say that this is a short workshop for a topic that we could probably spend several days unpacking together. So it's going to be a bit of a kind of a broad overview, but really my intention or my hope is that it's going to be an opportunity to engage in conversation and to do just some reflection about some of these topics, and hopefully to try out some new practices, or to take on some new practices that you might try out in your work. I know that many of the folks here are practitioners, so I really see this as a space where we can hopefully co-create and co-identify some strategies together, because I think that that's one of the benefits of being in a community like SEEDS. So as we go, feel free, if you have questions, to type them into chat. It's a little hard for me to look at both my screen and the chat at the same time, so Selena is going to help me by letting me know when there's different questions that are coming in. I just want to set some expectations that I may not be able to answer all the questions as we go, so we'll do our best, and then we'll have some time at the end as well. Okay, so let's move to group agreements. So I have some agreements that I've brought for today. So I'm inviting us to practice self-focus. So that's really about using I statements. So speaking from your own experience, your own stories, your own perspectives, and not be speaking on behalf of others. I'm also inviting us to embrace curiosity. So allowing space for curiosity and creative thinking, being open to new perspectives, particularly on some of these topics of power and privilege. They can bring up some stuff for folks. So just inviting us to stay into that space of, lean into that space of curiosity. Also share airtime and ensure all voices are heard. So given the size, we're probably, well, I see we have 45 folks on right now. We're probably not going to be able to hear from everybody in the large group space. So particularly for our pair sharing and our small group breakouts, please be mindful about sharing airtime. And also, this is an opportunity, especially given that we're going to be talking about power and privilege, to be mindful of any privileged identities that you hold, and help to create an environment where everybody can contribute. Last is intent versus impact. So for me, this is really about being accountable to each other for the impact of our words and our actions. So recognizing that our impact outweighs our intention. So there may be something that we say that unintentionally impacts somebody in a way that's harmful. Just to acknowledge and take responsibility for that. And also to remember that we're in a space where we're all learning. This is a learning workshop, and I apologize, my dog wants to be in the workshop as well, so if you hear any background noise there. So just remembering that we're in a learning space together. Okay, so I wanted to see with a thumbs up. Oh, I might have to stop share so I can see your faces to do this. I'd love to see with a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you're willing to abide by those agreements for a time together. So I'm going to scroll through, make sure I see everybody. Thumbs up. Okay. I see thumbs up. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Yes. I also want to name for any BIPOC identified folks or folks that have marginalized identities that there are no expectations that you're doing any teaching or expending any other emotional energy or labor in sharing your experiences, particularly for the benefit of those that may be in positions of power or privilege, particularly on these topics. So we're going to be talking about these topics, and there, I noticed that in a lot of workshops, oftentimes there's an unspoken assumption about that. That is not the assumption or the expectation here. Feel free to share to the extent that works for you in this space. And also acknowledging that people are, we're all in a spectrum in terms of our understanding and relationship with some of these topics, and that's totally okay too. That is real. Okay, so I'd love to hear, before we kind of dive in, I'd love to see again in chat. I'm gonna make sure I can see my chat, there we go. Give me a sense of who's in this virtual room. So are you a practicing mediator? Are you trained but not practicing? Are you in the ADR world or conflict transformation world but not doing mediation? Are you a community member? Are you a mediator at Seeds? Just give me a sense of who you are. So I would love to know that before I kind of dive into this. You can put it in chat. Okay, Seeds mediators. Great, okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of Seeds mediators here and folks that are doing mediation privately or in organizations. Great. Case, yep. Yay, great. Okay, excellent. Well, that's exciting to me because that means that, again, that was my guess, that we're a lot of practitioners here. So I look forward to sharing in this space and kind of co-creating and co-generating some of this with you all. Okay, so let's go into some of the core concepts. So for folks that have done the 40-hour training, especially recently, this will be a little bit of a recap, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page about some of these topics. So power, this is a definition that I'm bringing from Beth Roy, who is a Jewish mediator and author and sociologist. And I like her definition. She talks about power as the means by which we accomplish or are denied well-being. I like that part in particular. She talks about power as a process that's going on between and among people, a multi-layered and ever-shifting set of relationships that are shaped profoundly by the social structures in which we live. And so, yeah, this definition really pulls up the idea of power being this multi-layered process that's in relationship with others, that is informed by the structures in which we live. And particularly around that access to well-being, I find that part really helpful. Privilege. So privilege are unearned or is unearned social power and access to resources afforded to members and folks in dominant or advantaged groups, social groups, often at the expense of members in target or marginalized groups. And privilege operates on many different levels, personally, interpersonally, culturally, institutionally, systemically. So it's happening at all those different levels. And it's often invisible to those who have privilege. It's like that analogy of the fish in water, that in the areas where we have privilege, it's often invisible because we're in the midst of it. It's difficult to see what the norm is. And it's often actually easier to see the ways that we experience marginalization or oppression. I think it's important to understand privilege in the context of the systems of power in which we live. So things like patriarchy and white supremacy, that they're not only happening at the individual level where often that focus is, that we live within this larger context of systems, and that where power and privilege are constantly being played out. And at the individual level, just about everybody carries privilege of some form or another. So one example, the fact that we're all on a Zoom workshop on a Wednesday afternoon indicates a certain level of privilege, right? In terms of our access to the space, our ability in terms of our work life to be on a workshop like this at this time. I also want to acknowledge that our identities are intersectional. We are multidimensional people with multiple identities. And also that we may experience privilege and oppression at the same time. So for example, I might experience privilege as somebody with a high degree of education. I have a master's degree and have the class access afforded to me because of that. But simultaneously, I might also experience oppression as a person of color. And that privilege is nuanced in that as a person of color, but as an multiracial Asian American, I might experience more privilege than some of my Black and brown colleagues. So understanding like the range and the complexity of how privilege and power can show up, and that they can happen at the same time as oppression. Okay, it's moving on. Okay, so for those who are in the 40-hour mediation training, this will be familiar. This is a chart from the 40-hour training student manual. I think that's what it's called, right, Selena? So I want to bring this back as a point of reference. The chart looks at different categories of oppression in the middle column, and on the left are groups that are historically excluded, and on the right are groups that are historically included, and places where the folks that are included carry a lot of power in relation to these systems of oppression. So in the spirit of self-reflection, which is going to be a part of what we're doing today, I invite you to have a look at this chart from the perspective of your own identity as a mediator, as a person that supports people in conflict, and to think about where you hold power and where you hold privilege in relation to some of these systems, in relation to your own identities. Just take a moment to reground yourself in that self-reflective space. So I want to continue with a little bit more self-reflection, and you can jot down some notes if you want. You can just think about this in your head, that's fine. But as you think about some of those places where you hold power in relation to your own identities, thinking about how, in a context of mediation, how parties might perceive you related to your race, your gender, your age, your ability, all these different dimensions. And thinking about what are some of the assumptions that parties might make about you? And how might those assumptions impact the mediation process? So I invite you to do a little bit of reflecting on that. I also invite you to think about how might assumptions that you make or that we make about the parties impact the process or outcome? And you might think it doesn't, and that's fine. but I just invite you to do some reflections on that. And again, feel free to write down some notes or just kind of think whatever comes to mind. So for folks that feel that want to or feel comfortable, I invite you to just put into chat some things that come up in your self-reflection, some initial thoughts or reflections around that. I'm not seeing a lot in the chat, so that's fine if you don't have reflections on that. Okay, I'm seeing some folks talk about different assumptions based on our identities, generational differences. Yeah. Assumptions about people not understanding their experiences, awareness about how we present and how people perceive us. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Yeah, again, I think this is really helpful to think about how our identities are impacting both our perceptions of us and how our identities are may be impacting the way that we're perceiving others. So I want to move on to this next piece. Oops, here we go. About neutrality. So neutrality, as you are all very familiar, I know, as mediators, are core tenets within mediation, right? They're seen as essential to being an effective mediator. And it's a widely held, cherished ideas of neutrality in the process. And it might be controversial for me to say, but I think actually that mediation and that neutrality and partiality are elements of white supremacy. And the reason that I believe that is based on a lot of research and writing that's been done over the past decade on this topic, and also in my lived experience as a person of color, a practitioner of color doing this work. Because oftentimes mediation, the model itself is presumed to be culturally and racially neutral and objective. And with that assumption, the idea that it's transferable to diverse conflict contexts, so whether that's locally in our neighborhoods or internationally. And in actuality, mediation normalizes whiteness and reinforces white middle class norms. And again, there's a lot of research and writing that's been done on this. And one of the ways that happens, so looking at it from a intercultural communication framework, for those that are familiar with that framework, there's certain kind of categories of different types of cultures. So low context culture is one that mediation is based in that frame of low context culture, which tends to be characterized by linear, direct, task-oriented, individualistic. So there are folks that have done research on kind of overlaying the intercultural communication framework on top of mediation. And why I raise that, because there is this idea that the model itself is neutral, that it does not carry culture. It comes from a new, it's cultureless in a sense, doesn't carry that, that it has an objective perspective, when in fact it is informed culturally by a particular set of lenses and ways of being. And I think that that's really important to name and acknowledge, and then to start unpacking how does that carry out in terms of the process itself. So a lot of people talk about the myth of neutrality, and personally I think it's actually not possible to be truly neutral. Because we carry our lived experiences, our biases, our culturally informed lenses with us everywhere we go. And that certainly continues when we move into mediation. And that I think it's important to name that we have those. We can do our best to challenge our biases or kind of be aware of those, lenses, but I think it's also important to name that neutrality is not there. So additionally, another piece about this that happens related to neutrality is looking at the mediation model that's practiced in North America that was developed by white male practitioners. And so again, thinking about the lenses of which the frame and the model has been developed, and that the majority of mediators in the US tend to be white or come from privileged backgrounds. And so what that does is there's a particular set of lenses, cultural ways of being that are informing this process that are being talked about as being neutral. And again, I think this is, it's really important to acknowledge those pieces. So there are, I think I'm going to skip this quote. I was going to share this quote by two practitioners, but I'm going to move on from that and move to the next piece. So Leah Wing, who maybe some of you know, is the founding director of the Social Justice Mediation Institute. She's also a senior lecturer at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I actually worked with her when I did my social justice mediation training. She offers a couple different questions that I want to share with you that come from a chapter in a book called Recentering Culture and Knowledge in Conflict Resolution Practice, which is a great book. So she says that, or here are the questions she asks. What are the consequences when a mediator treats equally those who are on an uneven playing field? When differing experiences and access to power, decision-making, and respect impact the lives of the participant, who is better served when power inequities are attended to by neutrality? So the questions that she's raising are recognizing the unequal playing field that we live in, right? So in society, we're living in a society that where racism exists, where patriarchy exists, where we come from an uneven playing field. So what happens when folks who are in that context come into mediation, and how do we attend to power inequities that may show up if we're looking at it from the place of neutrality? So I actually want to break you up into do a quick pair share to talk about this. So I'm going to ask Selena to kind of get that set up. But I invite you to just reflect on like what's coming up for you right now when you think about these questions. What are some of the things that get raised for you when you think about what some of the questions that Leah is posing? We're just going to do a quick pair share, so it's going to be about 2 minutes per person, so 4 minutes total. I'm not quite sure if we're going to have even numbers, so it should mostly be pairs. It might be a group of 3 in there, but you'll have 4 minutes. So I'll let Selena invite you to the breakout room, and then we'll come back as a large group after that. And let me know if you have any questions about that process before we break.
Is there the opportunity to go in the chat?
Sorry, I didn't quite. Is there opportunity for what? The question in the chat? Yes.
Or the quote to go in the chat too?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Selena is on it.
There was someone who was unable to access the closed captioning and may have left the call, so you may want to reach out to address that.
Thank you. All right, we'll see everybody back here in a little bit.
Being like blind to differences, or that's probably not the best, but like being assuming that there's coming at something as if we're going to treat two people equally on an equal playing field erases their differences, erases the power imbalance, and sometimes acknowledging it and naming it can be helpful or might be helpful. And also the idea of this like false assumption that we would be able to come to something with, like what you were saying earlier, as a neutral person, because we have all of our own biases. We have things that we might not even be thinking about. And so of course you're bringing your own power and privilege into it. And so, yeah, we can't pretend like that doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Lauren. Yeah, I think about that sometimes in relation, you started to talk about like that idea of color blindness, I'm putting that in quotes, but the idea that may be well-intentioned, but again, like how the impacts that has and really being able to attend to some power inequities. Absolutely. Anybody else? Oh, I see that Michelle has a question. Sure, Michelle.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I understand like the concept of neutrality in terms of that we're all like mediator and parties coming to things from different identities, and it's not a level playing field, and that like oppression needs to be addressed. And yet I'm wondering like if there's a place for neutrality when it comes to things like mediating or not mediating for people like how does that, I guess I'm curious to hear more how it relates to maybe setting boundaries about when it is or isn't appropriate to mediate a certain case based on, like, let's say if you know the person who's asking you to mediate them or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's also an important piece around identifying. I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. Not that specific thing, but identifying like, is mediation the appropriate process to be using in a particular situation, and also are you the appropriate person to be doing that? So I think what you're raising is a good point. I think about that as separate from neutrality, and I think about that as just doing an assessment about and the approach that you're going to use, the person that's going to be doing that work. So yeah, I'll speak to that a little bit in a bit, but thanks for raising that, Michelle. Okay, let's move on to the next piece. So I want to talk a little bit more again about how some of these concepts are showing up in mediation, and this might be, old information for some of you and like maybe new information for other folks. So I'm just going to go through some of that. So implicit power dynamics, right, in systems of repression that are in society. So we're living in a society where racism is present, where patriarchy is present. All of that is happening, and that shows up in mediation, right? It shows up in a lot of places, but it also shows up in mediation. And so that can happen in dynamics between parties. It can happen in the role that we play as mediators. Just acknowledging that that's kind of what Leah Wing was saying around that unequal playing field that folks are coming in on. And the research that's been done has shown that mediation actually routinely reproduces privilege and reinforces inequitable power dynamics, both structurally and interpersonally between disputing parties. And what that does is it ultimately benefits high power groups, particularly white parties. And some of the ways that happens, I think, is as a result of this idea of neutrality, the idea that it doesn't allow us to actively interrupt some of those things. And so it's not surprising then that if in society, folks that are having more privilege or power, that's going to show up in the process itself, unless we're actively attending to that it's going to benefit those folks in the end as well. So something that I've noticed, particularly in my work in organizations and in schools, that mediation may unintentionally maintain oppressive structures. So oftentimes can be a focus on conflict at an interpersonal level, while in fact there are larger conflicts like structural racism or white supremacy or patriarchy that are maintained. So particularly in organizational context, the focus gets put on let's resolve the conflict at the interpersonal level when actually this larger piece is not being attended to or addressed, and that interpersonal conflict is directly as a result of or related to that larger structure. And Roberto Chenet, who I don't know if some of you may know, I think he's based out of New Mexico as a mediator there, talks about this. And he says that mediation, though helpful for immediate problem solving, allows the postponement of addressing the real source of the conflict, the oppressive nature of many hierarchies.
Elli, we have a question. Is now a good time, or would you like to keep moving?
Sure. What's the question? Yeah, I can't. Let me look at my chat. Can you speak to how to manage that dynamic? Yes. So we're going to, we're going to talk about that next around strategies and practices. I want to just pause before we launch into strategies and practices. Are there any questions on things that I've shared so far? I see, curious if the background of the mediator impacts the tendency to reinforce oppressive systems. I think it can. I think it depends on not necessarily the background, but our lenses, like what are lenses that we're bringing in as a non-white mediator perspective. I think it depends, like I said, it depends on the lenses that we're bringing in and acknowledging those lenses, acknowledging our biases that come into the process. I think part of what I'm speaking to is the individual mediator, right, and what we bring into that process, but I'm also speaking to the process itself and how the process has been set up structurally. So both of those things are present. I don't know if that answered your question or not. From Lucy, how do you see dynamics of power and oppression playing out between mediators occupying different social positions? I'm not sure. Do you mean like when you're co-working, you like co-mediating? Is that what you're talking about, Lucy?
Yes.
Co-mediate. So like when you co-mediate, how do some of those dynamics play out? I would love to hear from you all. I can see a couple of different ways that can play out. But I'd love to hear from folks too, if you have any thoughts on that. And in your experience of what you experienced. Oh, you're saying, Lynn is saying, I've been in that situation at the same time for the person who's absolutely necessary to deal with the immediate reason for coming to mediation. Yeah, so Lynn, are you saying like it's important to put the focus on the parties, the folks that are coming to the mediation? Like that's where the emphasis is? Yeah, intersectionality, definitely. So I'm going to move into this next piece around strategies and practices. And then again, this I hopefully can be like a generative place where we're all contributing to this. I absolutely want to talk about intersectionality because it's not so easy necessarily to determine kind of power up, power down sometimes because we hold intersectional identities. So that's definitely a piece of that. So let's go to this strategy and practice. So like now that we've talked about some of these ways that power and privilege show up in mediation and the process itself and in the dynamics, I want to talk about like, so what do we do about that? What are some strategies to address and interrupt some of those inequitable outcomes? And another question that I have is really like, how do we apply an equity lens or like an anti-oppression lens to this work? And that's a bigger question that I don't have the answer to, that I think is like an ongoing practice that we'll need to engage in. So this list is not at all an exhaustive list. It's like some ideas that I want to kind of generate conversation around. So first and foremost, if you haven't guessed this already, I think it's vital to engage in critical self-reflection around our biases and our assumptions. That is, really thinking about where are the places where we're not looking at some of our own biases and stuff around race, gender, ability, all these dimensions. And I also want to acknowledge that this is like critical and it's lifelong ongoing work, that it doesn't end when we read a book or we go to a conference. Like it's a constant state of being in that practice of self-reflection. So acknowledging that even coming to a workshop like this and like continuing to think about these things is a really important place to start. There's this term omnipartiality, which I'm sure many of you know, by Kenneth Cloak, which is a balance to the idea of impartiality, that we're not partial to anybody, but instead looking at that we're actually partial, we can be partial to everyone. And that I think that allows in some respect a more opening to look at our own biases as a mediator in the process than neutrality or impartiality does. Because the idea is that like no participant, including the mediator, can stand outside the context in which we're in, and it makes it a little bit more relational. I personally think this is better, but I actually think we need like new terms, we need new language, and I don't know what those are unless you all have some. Maybe we can coin some together. I think we need to kind of take this the next level, but that's one term that I think is better than the neutrality concept. So talking about co-mediation, I know SEEDS does this, right? This is a practice that SEEDS uses around co-mediation and balancing as much as possible the identities of the party. It doesn't address all of the systemic pieces, but I think it can help in terms of being aware and recognizing the identities and our lived experience and how that might show up in the process. So also acknowledging, oh, someone said balance. So like what I mean is like if some of the parties that are coming to the mediation are folks of color and you have an all-white mediator panel, like thinking about where the balance in terms of who's co-mediating in that place. That's what I mean by balance. Also acknowledging our identities, I think is I find that to be very helpful. So we bring them into the room whether we pretend to or not, right? Like we are who we are. Those are our identities. And I think it's helpful to acknowledge them and to see them as a benefit, see them as part of like our lived experiences that actually help us to empathize, to understand, and to support parties. So like naming that, just naming that from the get-go, where we're positioning ourselves. Okay. So also, I'm sure that many of you already do this, but doing a power analysis prior to beginning a mediation. So thinking about, based on the information that you have, right? In some cases, this may be more limited information, but based on the information you have about the parties, about the situation, thinking about what power dynamics might show up in that conflict or already be present. So either interpersonally or reflective of society at large, whether that's, again, dynamics around race or gender or age, or positional power, right? And like a tenant-landlord situation. Thinking about how that might show up and kind of mapping that and doing that analysis ahead of time. Also naming power dynamics and oppression when you see it. So I think that's helpful to just name like when that's happening. And I don't know if it's Barbara or Latrice uses this statement or phrasing. I'm noticing inequity in power dynamics related to race. Am I tracking that correctly, right? Like posing that as naming what you're seeing and then asking a question about it, I think can be helpful to acknowledge that. Also having the party power down party start. So again, when you're doing the power analysis and understanding some of the dynamics around the power and then figuring out who might be, again, we're making some guesses here because we may not always have the information until we get into the mediation, but who might be in a power down position. And again, acknowledging intersectionality and the ways that is really important to kind of name and understand the complexity of this. But part of the reason it's important I think it's helpful to have the power down party start again, in that as much as you can name that and identify that ahead of time, is that it frames the narrative. So there's some research that's been, there's some research, oh, where's my thing with this? Yeah, there's a study that was done about this that reviewed cases in mediation centers across the US, and it showed that in more than 80 cases, mediators favored the story of the first person to speak, and that the final final agreements align with the first person's narrative framing. And I think why that happens is there's this heavy reliance on turn taking in mediation, that we make sure that we want to make sure that everybody's equally having a chance to speak, and then we go back and forth and take turns. And what it does is it ends up reinforcing the first speaker's story, and puts the second speaker into more of a defensive, it can put them into more of a defensive position. And so again, like the ability to narrate one's story is also a position of power, right? The ability to share your story, the ability to have that heard. And in many cases, if that's what this research I find very fascinating shows, that it actually reproduces structurally if we're starting with the first person. So rather than saying, who would like to start when you're starting a mediation, actually asking the person in your analysis who might be the party down person to start the conversation is one way to address that. Also, controlling the length of time that each person speaks. So this already happens, we already do this in our practice as mediators, but paying attention to how that relates to power specifically. So that I think there's a way to assure that everybody's needs matter. I think there's a way to really affirm that everybody, all the parties, that their needs matter, and also actively support those that are less powerful in speaking their needs fully. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that people should speak at an equal length of time. I think, for example, if mediation is being conducted in English and one party is communicating in their second language, that there may need to be more space and time for that person's voice to share their story. That's one example. But also Leo Wing talks about kind of dominant narratives and master narratives, that one story that's being narrated that aligns with the main narrative, kind of related to society at large, is oftentimes easier to hear, particularly if someone comes from that same background, than somebody that's trying to tell a counter narrative that may take more time to express, to relay, or to have heard by the person that's hearing it, have it heard by that person. And so I think, again, not necessarily focusing on equal length, but looking at it from a power perspective, while at the same time very much affirming that everybody in that room, that their needs matter, that need to be heard. Yeah, that's what I was just saying. Go. So another thing, which I say ensure, but that's a challenging thing, but it's like to be mindful of the ways that we may not be aligning with white cultural norms unconsciously. So for things like suppressing the expression of emotion, right? So like there's idea that we should like control the emotion that's happening in the mediation context, and that is culturally informed, and that has different experiences by different people. So acknowledging that piece, and even things like ground rules, which are culturally informed by our ways that we communicate. And so for things like respect, right? Unpacking, when we say we asking people to respect one another in the process, what does that actually mean? Does my interpretation of respect is informed by my cultural experiences, which is maybe different from the people that I'm working with or that I'm supporting. And again, apologies for my dog. Choices about when and how to summarize. These are like micro choices that we're making all the time about how we summarize, what questions to ask. If we're trying to think about what are the cultural lenses by which I'm doing those things, and how is that impacting how I'm showing up in the process. Again, like lifelong process, lifelong journey here. Paying attention to a party with less, so again, we're having a power analysis, paying attention to power dynamics all the time, particularly for the party with less power in the agreement process specifically. So one of the ways that this can look is like making sure that a yes is really a yes. So if you have doubts about somebody's ability to actually express their needs due to those power differences, attending to that, particularly in the agreement process, and really supporting folks for their full needs to be able to be shared, to be expressed, and for that to come out in the agreement. So I mentioned this in working with organizations. Something that I think is helpful to be really mindful of are the ways that conflicts may reflect larger structural power imbalances, so that it's not just within the particular interpersonal dynamic, but it's within these larger structures. And then, like I said, doing an analysis of, if that's the case, is mediation the best approach? Does it need to happen in parallel with something else, some other approach that can address those pieces that goes beyond the realm of what mediation is meant to do? But thinking about it kind of from that holistic perspective, if we're trying to interrupt some of those imbalances. Last couple here, developing an anti-oppression equity-centered approach. So again, I'm kind of like calling for us to do more of this, to identify like, how do we think about, if we're aligning around the need for equity in our work, what does that look like? And how can we identify practices that effectively interrupt oppressive dynamics? So this is like an effort toward like, let's create more knowledge. Let's think about how to do this. And like I said, this list certainly is not exhaustive. These are some practices that you might try. And lastly, establishing a community of practice, I think, is very helpful to reflect, to learn, to grow. So as practitioners, to provide feedback to one another in this spirit of reflection and growth in our work. Having other people to do this with is very helpful. I'm actually working on creating a learning lab for conflict transformation practitioners of color with this consulting group. So if you're interested, let me know. But that's for that reason of creating this community of practice. Okay, so that is, I'll stop there. I would love to hear, we're going to be doing some breakout group work, and oh, I should probably do that soon. I'd love to hear, like, just from based on what I've shared, like I said, this is not a lot exhaustive list. This is kind of like a conversation starter around some of the approaches that we can try. I'd love to hear from you all if there are other things that you've tried that you found effective, ideas that you have around, like, what are some strategies and practices to really acknowledge some of the ways that power dynamics may show up and how we can address that in our role.
I have a reflection / question. So something I've been wondering about is, when you're in these spaces, how do you actually hold people accountable for continuing their sort of like, okay, how do you hold people accountable when you mess up in a way that's loving and also like educational? So calling in rather than calling out, but still making sure that it's addressed.
You're asking about like in the mediation process itself or in general?
So I guess more so infrastructurally. I'm thinking about how institutions react when things go wrong. So like there are a lot of ways that we can try to anticipate biases and problems culturally, but sometimes until we mess it up, we don't really know. So how do you build in some resilience, I guess, to be able to react and learn in that sort of situation?
Build in resilience to the large, like to the process or to the structure of the process itself, or are you talking about like as an individual engaging in that structure? Because there's so many dynamics to what you're asking. I want to make sure that I'm addressing that piece.
I guess I'm thinking of like as an organization, like there's a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of groups, and or you know like people add that to their company, new vice president. But if there's not really an accountability process, sometimes a lot of those nice learnings get just kind of like they're hanging out. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that goes beyond like the scope of what we're talking about in mediation, but that's the work that I often do in the DEI world is around like how do you hold accountable toward this actual behavior change. So it's not that there's like an awareness that happens right in this work, and you can apply that in a mediation perspective too. There's the important self-reflective and awareness part, but I think the most important part is the behavior change. What are we doing to actually change and interrupt places where it can be actively harmful for people? And I think maybe that's what you're talking about around the accountability piece. So there's different ways to do that within organizations. I think what I want to focus on also is like hearing from this group right now, like in relation to mediation, what are some other ways that you can see that happening like in this process? Oh, and somebody asked a question, how do you raise, you can just, maybe it's easier just to come off mute if you have a question, because I can't see everybody on my screen at the same time to call in.
Great. I have a quick question. Actually, two questions that I would love the wisdom of the space to talk about. So number one, I thought your point around mediators identifying and like just calling out their identities is really helpful. So I'd love to hear best practices for doing that, particularly around non-visible marginalizations. and how do you surface that in a way that's productive to the group? And then the second is, I loved the language that you shared. Thank you so much for, I'm noticing power dynamics regarding race. Am I tracking that correctly? I think that's a really powerful statement to just kind of notice a name. I think one thing that I love some knowledge around is in intersectionality, you're like, there's power dynamics playing, but like, I've been in situations where I'm like, I don't know if there's been so many multiple identities of, is it race? Is it gender? Like, do you just call out everything? Do you just say power dynamics period? Or do you try and like try to label what kind of lens is at play?
Yeah, are you asking the group at large?
I'd love to start off with your thoughts, but feel free to like open up. I know we have a lot of mediators that have dealt with this.
Yeah, exactly. I want to call on the wisdom in the room. Yeah, I think there's that phrase is from Barbara, I think. Am I tracking that correctly around these dynamics? I don't know if I'm accurately, yes, attributing it to Barbara. Yes, thank you, Barbara. So I think there's ways of like dropping it in without like taking up a whole lot of space around it, right? Like a question like that. I also think it can be helpful in parts of, in the work, in my approach is very relational in the work that I do. And so in the beginning, oftentimes I'm sharing, when I share about my identity and when I share about who I am. And that can happen, right? So you can like insert some of that there again, without taking up a whole lot of space, but saying like, here's what I come to with this work. Now I'm forgetting the last part of what you said. Anyway,
do you call it a power dynamic?
Oh, do you call it a power dynamic?
Yeah,
right.
Or in intersectionality where you're like, there's something at play, but I don't know what is the predominant one that's pulling it. So do you just say in general, I'm noticing a power dynamic, or do you try and list, or what's the most effective way to notice a name that?
Yeah, I think it depends. You could just say like, I'm noticing some power dynamics coming up right now. I think you could, I think it depends on what you're tracking on in that moment, like depending on what's being shared. If there's one piece of that that's helpful to pull forward, sometimes it might not be possible to these are so intersectional. Some of these dynamics, it might not be possible to parse them out, and that's okay, because that's part of life too. So I'm just noticing time. I want to actually get you into breakout groups, and we can do a little bit more group wisdom share also after that. So I want to, hold on a second, let me share my screen one more time to do these questions. So Selena can get ready to put us into, that was not what I wanted to have happen. Hold on a second. Okay. So I want to have you get into small groups to do a little bit more conversation about this, and to unpack like some specific experiences or cases that you've had, to get like very specific around this rather than more general. So I'd love for you to think about when have you experienced conflicts as a party to the conflict, or as a mediator, someone that was supporting other people through this conflict, that involved inequitable power dynamics, or that reflected systems of oppression. So where that was a dynamic that showed up in the conflict, to think about that. And then I'd love for you to think about like, what, if anything, did you do to address that inequity? Did you name it? What were some of the strategies or things that you did, if anything? And then thinking about what could you do in the future. So thinking about, again, like some of these practices and strategies, what are some specific things that you could try out to incorporate some of this in your work? So I'll give you a minute to just reflect on that before we break you out into breakout rooms. I also want to just name, it's like to be conscious, because they're going to share in your breakout groups around this. Be conscious of the conflict that you're sharing. Good conversations in your small groups, and kind of basing it in some tangible experiences that you've had. I'd love to just do a little bit of a group harvest, sharing any insights that came from that, things that, whether you want to share specific examples or strategies or things that came up in your groups. And again, feel free to just come off mute. It's hard for me to see everybody at the same time to call on you. So feel free to come off mute and share a bit.
I just want to briefly say that we talked about examples, and I gave the example of where I recently did a mediation with a man of color and a white man, a landlord tenant. The man of color was the landlord. The tenant had mental health issues, and how you and we kept trying to stress, intention and impact and how to respond. And particularly as a white woman and as an older white woman, I felt like I had to step back, and I didn't feel like I could be heard in talking with the landlord about, and he was very loud and very assertive, and the tenant was his mental health issues were apparent. So it was a difficult dynamic. I think I sent an email to Sarah saying, "Shit, that was hard," and I've talked about this a lot. So I don't know if we did the right thing. The agreement, I have no idea if it was followed through, but it sounded like they both agreed, but felt like, was the tenant really did he really fully grasp what he had to do, or what his part of the agreement was? And I'm not sure that really was true. The landlord was waving around a check saying, "I'll give you X amount of money if you move out." And the tenant has no money. So it was an interesting dynamic. I'm not sure. What would you have done, Elli?
Well, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that experience, Lynn. I appreciate the specificity and the challenge there, because it sounds like there were multiple dynamics and multiple sources of power that are happening, and I think that's complicated. I don't know if there's a one right answer for how to do that. To be, right. Yeah. I want to draw from the wisdom of the group here. There's a lot of wonderful experienced mediators. I feel like that's one of those things that's helpful to come to a community of practice to unpack together.
Yeah, hi.
Did it together, so she knows what I'm talking about.
Yes. I was actually the co-mediator there.
Oh, there you go.
And there was a different dynamic, but my perception comes in differently. And I don't know if it's because I have been an investigator, HR investigator for so many years, that I really wasn't tuned into, okay, I'm dealing with this African American, and okay, I'm dealing with this person over here. He seems like he has all the other sorts of problems. So I was really still focused on the context at hand. So I didn't have that feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm African American, he's African American, how are we going to make this connect? Where I was really still focused on what is the issue at hand. So it was a little bit different feeling for me. And maybe subconsciously, maybe I had a certain level of comfort with the African American, but I didn't really feel that way, even compared to the other guy, that he seemed like he had some issues. To me, seemed like more passive aggressive, and the other one seemed aggressive, but I had a different perception of the whole thing just because, and I don't know if it's because of my background or what that is. So I just wanted to jump in and say that.
No, I'm really glad you did, Patrice, because Patrice and I talked a lot about it afterwards.
Yeah. So I'm hearing, Patrice, that I think I'm catching, you're saying that even the understanding of how this person, I think it was a landlord that was showing up, the African American landlord that was showing up, and the ways that he was acting, whether he was aggressive or not, and that you had a different perspective even to Lynn about how that was playing out, and that you were focused on not so much on that piece of it, but what the actual part to come to an agreement between the two of them. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful example of even the two of you having your different perspectives of how you're analyzing that situation and how you're making choices in that moment is exactly what we're talking about. I don't know if there's a right or wrong, there's not a right answer to this, just having that conversation and being aware of how that's playing out, how we're perceiving what's happening in the room. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just want to add that Patrice and I, during the break we really talked a lot about that, you know, about how do we deal with the whole thing. And afterward, so it was, yeah, it was an interesting mediation.
Good learning experience, huh?
Yes, that's what Patrice kept saying.
Oh, that's great.
Elli, since you asked if any of us have any input on this, I'd like to say something about when I hear Lynn say that she had doubt whether the tenant did actually know what he was agreeing to, whether he was really fully conscious of his responsibilities. That to me is a little bit of a red flag. And I know at Seeds, we don't exactly encourage breakout meetings, individual meetings with individuals. But if I was worried that somebody is not clear about what they're agreeing to, I would probably try to do individual meetings with both parties briefly to check in with them and see what their understanding is. Because I think that would be a safer place for the less, power under person to say if they're really worried about something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is there. Yeah, I can't speak to I'm not a mediator at Seeds, so this might be different. I have to defer to Barbara on this, in terms of the approach with the communication. But I agree there in the conflict that you're speaking to, it sounds like there's multiple layers there. And so if we're talking about power in terms of somebody's mental health and their ability to actively participate in that process, I think that's an important piece that you're speaking to as well, Katrina. Yeah.
And just to speak to the Seeds process thing, I think, as Katharina said, we try to minimize the individual caucusing, but especially around issues around power and the idea that someone may not be able to speak something out in the shared space, that's when it can be a good time to use a private meeting or caucus.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Barbara. Okay, we have maybe time for one other person to share any insights or reflections on some of the small group, and when you're in your small group, some of the things that came out of that.
I could share a bit, which I talked very briefly in my small group, that I haven't mediated yet. I've just observed. And I was really appreciative that one of the the two parties were African-American co-parents. And she spoke right off the bat that there were two white men in the room. And there was one African-American mediator and myself and a white man. And I'm trans, and I've lived most of my life as a woman. I've transitioned pretty recently. And I have one of my parents is from South America. I'm a mixed race trans person. So it was an interesting moment to be called a white man and have an urge to correct it, and also not, because I understood that in that moment, it wasn't really the place to assert myself. And then reflecting on it a lot myself, and it's obviously for myself in my life, I'm always reflecting on it, but yeah, I think that maybe there are moments where when we do the intro round, I might speak it sometime, or maybe I won't. I don't know. It's a personal question for myself, but it was a moment that I've been thinking about.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing this. That I appreciate that. There's some of the things that you're speaking to. So even when I was saying people have perceptions of us that may or may not match with how we identify ourselves, and that happens in the world, right? That happens everywhere. So that certainly can happen in a mediation context. And we're doing the same thing where we're identifying or making assumptions about people. It goes both ways. And I think that can be in this case. It sounds like in that example, you're one of the folks in the room was saying out loud the thing that she's or that they're having in their, that they're believing about who's in the room and how that impacts their ability to show up in the space, is what it sounds like when that person was saying that. And that's partly what I'm talking about, of being conscious of those things, being conscious that those things are happening all the time. And so exactly to that point, I personally find it helpful in the introduction time to name that, about how I identify, how that impacts, like not just the work that I'm doing, but how I identify, because I know that people are going to be having perceptions and assumptions. And so it just helps to kind of put it in the room. And, again, it doesn't have to take up a whole lot of space, but that's a process that I use that certainly it sounds like and it would be a personal, like you're saying, Sid, it would have to be a personal choice about what you share, how much you want to disclose in that moment. But particularly if it feels like it's going to be relevant to how people are perceiving folks or perceiving me, I certainly include that in my intro. Yeah. Okay, so we are amazingly almost out of time. So I wish we had more time, because I feel like like I said, there's so much wisdom in the room that I would love to just gather this. I know that's one of the wonderful things about Seeds as a community. There's a lot of amazing practitioners to pull from the wisdom in the room. So thank you so much for participating in this workshop today. I wanted to let you know, I think somebody had asked about whether we're going to share the presentation. Happy to do that. So I think Selena can follow up around that. Just to close, I want to see if you can share, and this might be easier just to put in chat as opposed to coming off mute to do this, but one thing that you appreciate or one thing that you're taking away from this time, I would love as to know for you. You put it in chat for me. Manny asking, do I do a more in-depth class? I don't right now, but I could. I don't have a longer class on this right now. Yeah, there's definitely always more to learn. Keep exploring. Great. Yeah. Appreciate this. So thank you, everyone. This is, like folks are saying, this is ongoing, lifelong work. So this is just one part of a long, year-long process that will continue. So I appreciate just the opportunity to do some self-reflecting and some processing in groups. Yeah, I wish you all a good rest of your day. Here's my contact information. If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to